Hello and welcome for a new episode of the Leaders in Supply Chain podcast. I am your host, Radu Palamariu, Managing Director of Headquartered Global, and it's my pleasure to have with us today Francisco Betti. Francisco joined the World Economic Forum in May 2015, and he is currently leading the platform for shaping the future of advanced manufacturing and production, which was launched by the forum at its annual meeting in 2017. And is helping global leaders anticipate how advanced manufacturing technologies are transforming factories, business models, and partnerships, and to understand the implications for the economy, society, and environment in order to shape a more inclusive future. Prior to joining the World Economic Forum, Francisco worked for PricewaterhouseCoopers in Geneva, primarily running management consulting projects for international organizations. Francisco, thanks a lot for making the time, and it's a pleasure to have you.
Delighted to be with you today, Radu. Thank you for hosting me.
So first, I'd like to begin by talking about COVID-19 and the changes that obviously the pandemic has created across supply chains and manufacturing in general across the world. And I wanted to get your 30,000 feet view in terms of what are some of the main trends that you have seen by talking to senior executives within manufacturing and supply chain in the forum.
Absolutely, Radu. And let me start by saying that we did run a consultation as we were midway into the first wave of COVID-19. So that was about May 2020, with over 400 executives, so chief operating, chief supply chain officers. And I think that over 80% of them acknowledged that their supply networks were disrupted for the very first time, both on the demand and supply side. And that was, of course, unprecedented. Now, I think that what COVID-19 created, it's really what we could define as a perfect storm across manufacturing and supply systems. Now, what is important to remember is that that perfect storm was already forming in the horizon earlier and much before the pandemic arrived. Now, why I'm saying that is because if you look at the past 3-4 years and you look at how the fourth industrial revolution and the technological transformations that we see today have been taking a new speed, and you combine and you add that to climate change and the imperative for sustainability. And you look in addition to how the global economy, and I would say also the geopolitical dimension of the global economy has evolved over the past years. So when you combine, fourth industrial revolution, climate change, global economy, you could argue that there was already a storm forming in the horizon. Now, what COVID-19 brought in, it's a massive acceleration of those transformations that were taking place and a level of disruptions which was unprecedented, and that forced both manufacturers and supply system players to rethink the way in which they operate.
Indeed, and it also arguably we live in a time where it's almost like the crisis has become the new normal. And whilst we've never seen something like COVID-19 before, we've seen either a volcano erupting or trade wars or all sorts of different situations which kind of force the supply chain professionals to get into this crisis mode almost non-stop. And that brings me to the point of also this has created new business models, and that has created and has forced companies to adopt new business models. And I know that you've done quite a bit of work and research on that. So I wanted to pass it to you and maybe expand on some examples and what you have seen at the forum in terms of companies that have shifted or adapted their models to best fit the current reality.
Absolutely, Radwan. We saw massive acceleration of innovation, not just on the operation side of things, to, of course, respond to the pandemic and keep facilities up and running, but also massive innovation in the way in which companies are delivering value to their customers. Companies were able to rapidly pivot and get started into what is e-commerce. And I think that was the major manifestation. But we also saw unprecedented levels of collaboration across different companies to fill in the gap that emerged on the supply side. And I think if you look at how companies realized how fast they could innovate, of course, the public health crisis was a major driver of it. If you remember, and you go back to the first months of the pandemic, back in March, April, the first driver that brought companies together and accelerated innovation was the need to come up with new solutions, whether it was on the PPE front or on the medical devices front. We saw companies getting together to start making PPE, to start making new devices, and that's through strengths and cross-company collaboration. Now, I think that made companies realize that it was possible to transform not just operating, but also business models at scale. And then we saw that happening when it comes to product design and development, when it comes with the way in which companies interact with their customers. And I mentioned before e-commerce, but there are other examples as well. And finally, the way in which they design their operations for those new mechanisms of value delivery to be put in place. Now, I believe that, the transformation of operations and business models is one conversation. To change the way in which you interact with your customers, develop new products, get into services, engage with customers through new avenues. You do need to rethink the way in which you are operating your company. And we are seeing that being implemented now, that at speed and across multiple industry sectors. And just to recap and mention some of the what we believe are the changes that or the actions that companies are taking to enable, again, the transformation of operating and business models. I think that you hear that regularly from the executive you work with, but almost every company is looking at how to diversify its own supply system as one of the main pillars and foundations for reducing disruptions across operations, but also to enable then the transformation of broader value chains. They're all looking at the future, of work and the future of remote control of operations. And we believe that that's something that will take more and more emphasis. They are working on flexibility and agility, which is absolutely needed, back to the business model's point, to respond to consumers' demand in new ways and at the speed that is required. We have seen consumption patterns change radically over the past 6 months, and that will continue. There are new generations that were, not new generations, but there were entire generations which were, for example, not used to e-commerce, were forced to be at home, especially those who are over 60, and that enter the e-commerce world. So, that's a major change, and it's a new, set of customers and population in the e-commerce space. And then the need, I think beyond that, the need to ensure end-to-end supply chain transparency and visibility. We know that one of the, and it goes beyond just having end-to-end value chain connectivity. I think is the need to be transparent and visible, which also requires, new ways in which companies and their suppliers need to be working, once again, to enable that end-to-end transformation that will enable new business models. Now, just to conclude on that, why I believe it's important is because if we look at the post-pandemic world and we look at how companies will be able to drive growth, I believe it's through the transformation of both operations and business models, and new ways of operating manufacturing and supply systems will enable business models innovation. It may not be a surprise to you, but we are seeing more and more this conversation on innovation in new business models driven and led within companies by chief operating and chief supply chain officers.
And I know that one of the most insightful pieces of research that you put together every year at the forum is the Global Lighthouse Network, which showcases the most advanced factories in the world. I believe this year there were 54, so there were 10 new on top of the 44 last year. I wanted to ask you, Francisco, from your perspective, what are some of the new trends that you've observed in this? Ultimately, these are the jewels of manufacturing, right? That the combination of artificial intelligence, robotics, analytics, sensors, these are the best manufacturing facilities in the world. What are some of the new findings that emerged this year when you put together the report compared to previous years?
Absolutely, and let me share some context on the Global Lighthouse Network for those who may have not heard about it yet. But the Lighthouse Network is almost a window into the future of manufacturing and operations. What we did is that we started our research in collaboration with McKinsey. That was back in 2017, and we realized that most companies were stuck in what we describe as pilot purgatory. What is pilot purgatory? It's the challenge they are facing, which means that they are over-investing in pilots, but they are seeing limited success when it comes to developing new applications and especially deploy them at scale across their manufacturing and supply systems. So what we did is that we said, well, 70% or majority of companies are stuck or acknowledged to be stuck in that pilot purgatory space, but there's a 30% who is seeing a significant operational and financial impact already. So in a nutshell, we develop a process, an independent review process, to scan, assess, and identify and recognize those companies who are literally shedding light, which is why we call them lighthouses, in the digital transformation of manufacturing and supply systems. And we have, as you said, we have 54 of these lighthouses in our network to date from all across the world, from the US to China, going through India, Europe as well, but also Latin America and Asia. They are all very unique and quite amazing. As I mentioned before, they have all demonstrated significant operational and financial impacts when it comes to the adoption of very specific use cases. So here we are not talking about technology in general, but we are talking about the practical application of technologies in combination to address very specific operational and business challenges. Now, what these lighthouses are doing is that they are setting new benchmarks. When you look at the results that we have observed, whether it's on productivity, sustainability, agility, speed to market, and even customizations, we are seeing improvement that range from 10 to 100%, so doubling the impact, especially in the productivity case. I think it's revealing to see how, new use cases driven by advanced manufacturing, Industry 4.0, intelligent manufacturing technologies are helping increase factory output, productivity, OEE, product cost reduction, and so on. Now, when it comes to the current context and the pandemic, I think it was not a surprise, but we also saw these lighthouses being probably the most successful when it comes to respond to the new challenges that we are facing. And what is interesting is that if you look at, and you were asking about the latest finding, if you look at the latest development, there are 4 common threads that we have observed across all of them in the current context, and that I believe are going to become what we are calling durable shifts. So shifts that are here and will stay in a post-pandemic world as well. The first one is that they are all embracing agility and customer centricity as they transform and they walk backwards on their operations, which allows them, again, agility, flexibility, customer centricity, allows them to respond faster to new customer preferences and changing demand, and adjust the production flows accordingly. Now, what that means, and it's interesting, is that it may mean for some industry sectors what we call small-scale modular plants. So even the way in which facilities are being reconfigured is changing. And in the future, we will likely see more facilities distributed of smaller case, and that thanks to technology, will have the ability to make a broader variety of products. Now, the second, let's say, durable shift or common threat that emerged in the pandemic and will likely stay in the post-pandemic scenario is what we call the need to embrace supply chain resilience and move away from just-in-time cost competitiveness into risk competitiveness. And they all realize that resilience is and will be a major competitive advantage going forward, and that requires rethinking the supplier's ecosystem, and again, to mitigate risk and allow flexibility at the supply chain level. Now, there's a third thread and fourth durable shift, which is related to the fact that speed and productivity is reaching new and unprecedented levels. And I think that here there's often, people tend to think about just automation and robots, and that's not the case. We are seeing that all lighthouses, or most lighthouses, they are achieving speed and significant productivity increases through a combination of automation and workforce augmentations. Workers are playing a major role when it comes to the adoption of the design and adoption of new use cases, and are playing a major role when it comes to improving increase and productivities. And all that, of course, in the current context with the additional challenge, which is, leveraging automation and workers augmentation to ensure a safer environment and prevent future disruptions that may come from new outbreaks. Now, the important point on that, rather, I think, is that and I want to emphasize this, is that all these companies have done major investments in upskilling and reskilling, and that it's enabling them to take automation and augmentation to the next level. And then finally, I think is the concept, and that's the fourth durable thread and shift, is the fact that they are all embracing eco-efficiency, that sustainability is becoming a key driver of their resilience and risk management strategy. And not just to complain, I said it's not just because we need to comply with a new regulatory landscape, but it's also because it's the right thing to do. And companies are observing that today, thanks to technology, it is possible to drive productivity increases, reduce costs, and be more sustainable at the same time. Maybe one observation, I know that your audience is mainly chief operating and supply chain officers. I think that what is interesting to observe is that, again, the sustainability conversation, it's more and more a topic that is driven within companies by chief operating and supply chain officers. So the ones who are at the forefront of the transformation of manufacturing and supply systems are the ones who are embracing and leading the, let's say, the sustainability revolution in manufacturing. And I believe that that's a major change compared to a year ago.
And I want to ask your perspective, because whilst this 54, and I do actually want to encourage everybody to read the report, and it's fascinating. I read it several times because it's quite a lot of content and many useful case studies. So these 54 factories that are spread across the world are the best in class. Now, I guess my question, to your point of companies being stuck trial and error and different testing and pilot purgatory, as you called it very vividly, what would be your advice to the thousands upon thousands of other factories, right, and other manufacturing plants across the world? How could they, because we're not going to have 2,000, 3,000 lighthouses, but what would be the low-hanging fruit that maybe even smaller or medium-sized companies and their factories could look at in order to move the needle to the next steps in terms of their Industry 4.0 journey?
That's a great question, Robert. I think that probably one of the reasons of why many are still stuck in pilot purgatory is because there is a sort of an obsession for and by technology, right? We tend to focus a lot on technology, but we forget that to successfully drive the digital transformation of manufacturing, there are a series of enablers that are essential and that companies need to work on. And that was one of the most revealing findings of this network, right? The digital transformation journey is not a technology-driven conversation. Yes, technology played a major role, but it's a broader company strategy in which we have elements such as workforce transformation, skilling and reskilling. All lighthouses have massively invested in training programs for their shop floor operators and engineers. It has to do with mindset change and change management and finding new ways through which companies can create a pulling effect versus a pushing effect to use cases and new solutions. It has to do as well with the need to, as I mentioned before, to think about long-term, not just about short-term cost reduction, which has been always the challenge in operations, but be able to embrace new dimensions such as sustainability, as we were discussing before. The most important point is that we call them like houses. People tend to refer to them to a window into the future or factories of the future. Let me just be clear. I mean, these are, let's say, they are shedding light on how the future of manufacturing will look like, but we haven't found the factory of the future yet. The factory of the future probably doesn't exist. This is a continuous improvement and learning journey. Now, what we have in the network is, companies with clear demonstrated impact, and we have some companies which may fall. I mean, the definition of SME is always a challenging one, but we even have companies who may fall into the SME category and were able to transform themselves by using, for example, commercial technology. We have a great example of a company using commercial smart watches that they have reset it to monitor for the operators and the shop floor engineers to monitor operations in real time and get alerts and signs, certain signals. So I think that, just to conclude, I think it's that it's not a technology play only. You need to work on all the enablers and have a company broad strategy. That's what all lighthouses have done. It's an ecosystem play as well, collaborating with local test beds, capability centers, and universities, working with your network of suppliers and customers in an integrated way. I mean, that's essential as well. It is an ecosystem play. And then finally, being aware that it doesn't matter whether you are a large company with a lot of funding for research and development or a small company with limited resources, there may be technologies and solutions that are affordable at all levels. This is all about taking your digital transformation to the next level to improve productivity, efficiency, reduce costs, while enabling workforce transformation and sustainability.
And on the topic of mindset, which is, well, usually the biggest impediment to change is our own mindset. So I'd like to double click a little bit and focus on that and zero in and ask you, from what you have observed and maybe from the companies that might move a little bit slower, what are some of the main shifts in the mindset of their executives, whether they're at the CEO level or COO or Chief Supply Chain Officer level, that you think still need to be made in order for this change to be accelerated?
Absolutely. And what we have observed is that those companies who are really ahead of the curve and ahead of the game work on that mindset change on three levels. CEOs and CFOs and CTOs were convinced, but they were convinced because they ran the right analysis and they saw the potential return on investments, right? So there was a strong business case for making this happen. And this is when this connects back to the business model conversation. They were convinced about the cases because they saw that the digital transformation of their facilities and supply systems were not only help them optimize production and the delivery of goods, but were also setting the foundations for new business cases and new business models to be developed and implemented. So let's say that there is a mindset change that is required and that we have seen taking place at most of these lighthouse companies at the top level. And if there is not, I would argue that if there is not conviction that this is something we should be investing in from the top, plans will not fly. Then the second tier, which has been often the most challenging one, is the middle management. And that's where at least some of the companies acknowledge that there were a lot of resistances, whether that was from the head of IT who raised a concern on cybersecurity, or your most experienced managers who were used to drive the operations in a certain way, and that we were, for years forcing to be obsessed by and look at cost reduction. And we are now coming, with new approaches to achieve that. And then finally, the shop floor engineers and operation. I think that for that third tier, what we saw being extremely successful was companies who had, for example, the research and development teams working in close collaboration with the shop floor operators. And that created almost a pulling effect, right? That we saw companies who got new devices that made the life of the shop floor operators much easier. They brought them in for a pilot and it was impossible to then take them away because workers saw how better and how easier their tasks were made and facilitated with those devices. So I think that the importance is to drive and have this mindset change at all those three levels. But I believe that ultimately, once you have the conviction at the top, once your middle management is ready to embrace change and think about transformation in a new way, I think it's the engagement of your workforce that ultimately makes the difference. I visited not all, but most of the 44 lighthouses, but also many of the other thousands of facilities that we assess and work with throughout the identification process. And it's fascinating when you go to the shop floor and you see, shop floor operators explaining the use cases, committed, to taking them to the next level. I think that that's where, once again, people make the real difference here.
No, absolutely. I could not agree more. And on the people front, and given the level of automation and robotics, and well, you have machine learning, we have a lot of technology that is expanding at a fast pace and also taking a lot of the human tasks away, and a lot of them are repetitive and it should be taken away so that humans can focus on higher yield and more analytical tasks. But it's a very tricky question, and I don't know anybody on the planet if anybody has the answer to this, but how do you see also the challenges that will occur from technology developing so fast, and at the same time we as humans might have a lag, right, in terms of adapting, learning, reskilling, upskilling? How do you see this moving in the future, and what are some of the things that companies can practically do to constantly upgrade, I guess, their stuff?
Absolutely. And if we look, rather, if we look at the, it's very interesting how you're formulating the question. So if you look at the evolution of technology as a curve and the number of investments that were made on upskilling and reskilling across industry sector and even at company level, there's clearly a gap, right? And technology is developing exponentially at an incredible pace, while it's not always possible to upgrade skills in the same way. I think that the main challenge is that we probably need to rethink the way in which we approach skilling and upskilling, and the way in which we have been that until today, even in a very successful way in countries like Germany, France, Italy, but also Singapore and other countries, may not be the way to do it in the new context, and in the advanced manufacturing industry 4.0 intelligent mass manufacturing context. My belief is that companies are more and more moving into frameworks of continuous on-the-job training, which means that probably as shop floor operators, we will see programs that will run throughout the year and forever, through which we'll be looking at new technologies, we will be getting people more familiar. It's important also to understand that there's a generation that has to be, and it's probably not the younger generation, but it's the generations that are not digital natives, who require some basic digital literacy to be able to then understand what an AI-driven application means and looks like. So I think it's working on digital literacy and using that as the foundations to move from a one-off into continuous on-the-job training. For shop floor engineers, someone could imagine, engineers going back and forth in between in the company job and universities, or creating a constant flow and a different way in which engineering universities will be interacting with companies. Why not? I think what is important in this workforce transformation story is to say that 70%, and we have observed that through some research, 70% of tasks in manufacturing remain human-driven and manual, right? So manufacturing is still primarily a human-driven activity. Yes, we are seeing automation and robots taking off at speed, but the story of automation is not new. It's over 100 years old, right? It's part of the cost efficiency and continuous improvement journey. What is important to note is that today automation is mainly helping facilitate what was before a repetitive, dangerous, or even boring task. But still, we are seeing in many cases, technology helping augment workers' capabilities, I mentioned before. So I think that the automation trend will continue, but that doesn't mean that we won't need workers anymore. And also the other important point is that we do need to take a step back and look at the automation equation with the broader lens, because it's only when you look at the entire value chain that you can identify those nodes and pockets in which technology may have a negative impact on the workforce. But you will also be able to identify those pockets and areas in which technology will help increase the number of workers that are needed. Think about the research and development side of sales, design, post-manufacturing services. We are likely going to see a major job increases in those areas. I think that finally the end question is, how do we manage the transition in a fair and just way, especially for those segments of the workforce who are probably most exposed. And for that, going back to the initial point, I think that new ways of approaching upskilling and reskilling and moving into continuous on-the-job learning is going to be the trend going forward.
Final question, and I would be curious to get your perspective on this, because our day job being executive search and headhunting, and we are sometimes tasked by companies in their supply chain to bring talent that comes perhaps from a lateral field or left field. So we worked on a CTO position for a manufacturing company, and we wanted somebody to come from a gaming industry. There's a lot of requirements right now for skills related to analytics, to data science, to algorithms, where basically a manufacturing company would find for the same talent pool as Google and Facebook and the tech giants of the world. What do you see as most needed for the manufacturing facilities, for the supply chains of the world, in terms of bringing people from perhaps left field or a different industry to best be creative and come up with new solutions?
It's a great question. My sense is that if I look at it, again, we are in daily contact with many executives who come from different backgrounds, and often not just engineering, but I think that, there's always be a degree of technical knowledge that will be required for people in charge of operations, right? You need to understand how the facility functions and run. However, What I believe is going to be needed more going forward is people would come with a 360 degrees view that understand that to succeed in the future landscape, cost competitiveness, and looking at ways on how to reduce cost through technology is not going to be enough anymore, that sustainability is going to play the major role, that you need to engage with your people in new and different ways, that you need to embrace change management. So I think we're going to probably see a tendency in which we'll see more and more executives who maybe have a new balance when it comes to technical knowledge and that 360 degrees view. And by the way, what we are doing at the forum and through the framework of our platform on the future of advanced manufacturing and production is bring executives from across multiple industry sectors together to engage in this type of conversations that help them broaden their view and vision. So again, I think that, we will need more and more people with a vision and not just with the strategy, but then people with a vision who can then turn that vision into a practical strategy and that can embrace what we have seen are going to be the major pillars of resilience, successful operations, but also the enablement of new business models, which is technology, people, and sustainability.
Thank you very much, Francisco. This has been very insightful and practical. Much appreciate all the sharing and all the case studies, and continue to inspire us with the work at the forum and continue to put out great reports that I cannot stress enough. And I have shared it with a lot of people, and I want to share with our audience to look it up on the World Economic Forum website, and it's all publicly available, or a lot of it is publicly available. So do find inspiration hopefully there. So once again, thanks for joining us today, and it's been a pleasure to have you.
My pleasure, and I look forward to staying in touch, Rob.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. If you like what you heard, be sure to go to www.elcotglobal.com and click the podcast button for all the show notes of the interview. Also subscribe to our mailing list to get our latest updates first. If you're listening to a streaming platform like iTunes, Spotify, or Stitcher, we would appreciate a kind review. 5-star works best to keep us going and our production team happy. And of course, share it with your friends. I'm most active on LinkedIn, so do feel free to follow me. And if you have any suggestions on what to do and who to invite next, don't hesitate to drop me a note. And if you're looking to hire top executives in supply chain or transform your business, of course, contact us as well to find out how we can help.